No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 18. Goodbye, Buccaneers. Hello, Pirates. From Cartagena, a single road led into the interior, twisting through a swamp. Any force heading along that road toward Cartagena, as the Buccaneers must now do as the vanguard, would first be brought up short by a steep-sided pinnacle of volcanic rock, where, as on a pedestal, stood the convent of Nuestra Señora de la Popa, the patron saint of Cartagena. Heavily fortified, La Popa was an awesome obstacle, and as if that were not enough, the Buccaneers would have to rely for fresh water on what little they could carry with them. Over the decades, Cartagena's authorities had repeatedly vetoed suggestions that an aqueduct be built to carry water from the interior. Under siege conditions, such a structure could not be defended, and would only help an enemy. Cartagena's own water supply came from the clouds. There was hardly a flat surface above ground level that was not connected by pipe to one of the thousands of cisterns in the city. If the water from the cisterns was sometimes a little putrid, it was still far healthier than that from the puddles and brackish bogs outside the walls. The Buccaneers were reluctant to enter the small boats that would take them from Tierra Bomba to the mainland. With Ducasse incapacitated by his wound, Pontus had appointed a leader from his French officers who, according to Pontus himself, had not acquired either the esteem or love of anybody. Pontus later claimed that he devolved to threatening to burn their ships and abandon them if they did not obey. Far more likely, the well-respected Ducasse, incapacitated though he was, talked his ruffians into doing as they were directed. After all the arguments, La Popa itself was anticlimactic. The Spanish had deserted the place, although not until after a train of 110 mules fleeing from Cartagena laden with gold and gems had passed through. The bloodless fall of La Popa pinpointed the fatal flaw in Cartagena's defenses. For all their technical genius, Spanish engineers could not account for human nature, and the myriad fears by which it is afflicted. Each of the forts leading to the gates of Cartagena was built to withstand protracted sieges, but each was separate and alone, cut off from and unable to communicate with the other forts or with the main Spanish force inside the city. The defenders were victims of their own imaginations. And so they ran. It happened at Boca Chica and La Popa, and it would happen again. With La Popa now their own, the Buccaneers moved to the next fort in the line, San Lazaro, constructed on the only solid ground within cannon shot of Cartagena. There they were joined by Pontus and his French regulars, who had been having a more frustrating time than Ducasse's men. The Baron and his men had meant to pass through Boca Chica once the fort had been secured, and sail right up the bay to bombard Cartagena. But that was easier said than done. The city lay on the northern shore of a lagoon that served as an inner harbor. The narrow entryway was guarded by opposing sandspits, reaching toward each other like closing tongs, on which the Spanish had constructed defenses. On the eastern tongue stood little more than manned bulwarks, but on the western side of the lagoon entrance stood the imposing fort Santa Cruz. This fort would have to be taken before Pontus's ships could make their way into the lagoon. Thus, Pontus decided to march 1,700 men across the causeway that had been formed between Tierra Bomba and the mainland. He would then be in position to take one of the sandspit bastions, Fort Santa Cruz, from the rear, after which he could move his fleet into the inner harbor and lay siege to the city itself. While the fleet moved up the bay toward Fort Santa Cruz, the land force approached the bastion cautiously, and with good reason, since Ducasse later estimated that a mere 300 Spanish could have held the position for days and perhaps weeks. But again, to Pontus's perfect astonishment and vast relief, the Spanish were gone. Putting a skeleton force in Santa Cruz so that it could not easily be retaken by the Spaniards, Pontus did not immediately return for his fleet, which was now waiting in the bay just off the fort. Instead, he quickly marched this force of 1,700 men toward the city. The townspeople were congregated on the walls, looking quietly down upon them. Among them was the governor, Don Diego de los Rios y Quesada, who, wrote Pontus, answered my drum that he was ready to defend himself better than we could attack him. Pontus soon learned that the governor was right. The area where Pontus had drawn up his army was all sand and marshland, too unstable to mount cannon. Frustrated again, Pontus ordered his men re-embarked in the ships to cross the lagoon and join the Buccaneers where they lay hidden in the woods outside Fort San Lazaro. The fort would have to be captured and Cartagena taken from the rear. San Lazaro, occupying a commanding position atop a steep hill, was enough to give pause to even the most reckless attacker. The crenellated walls were so devised as to provide an interlocking pattern of cannon fire, and the masonry of the entire edifice was massive. But the French soon discovered that the eminence on which the fort stood was so densely covered with thicket that they could creep unseen to the very foot of the walls. Hacking a tunnel-like path through the brush, they prepared to mine the walls with gunpowder and blast their way in. Small arms fire did break out, but to bring their pieces to bear, the defenders had to lean over the walls, and the French snipers could pick them off. At the same time, Pontus called for scaling ladders to be brought up, in a voice loud enough to be heard by the Spanish. As at San Luis, La Popa, and Santa Cruz, Spanish nerves began to fray, and suddenly the gates of the fort flew open, and the Spaniards came pouring out, racing pell-mell down the road to Cartagena. Pontus let them go. San Lazaro was now his. Now, at last, the French commander brought up his ships to begin a bombardment of Cartagena's immediate environs. On the morning of April 21st, 1697, a steady fire was commenced against the massive limestone walls of Gestemani, a fortified island suburb over which a road led across two bridges to Cartagena's main entryway, the Gate of the Half Moon. Cartagena also came under fire, but the defenders fought back furiously. Pontus reported that one French ship was forced to withdraw after it was shot through with several balls and ready to sink. Pontus's chief engineer was badly wounded, and the admiral himself was hit in the abdomen with a piece of grapeshot. The wound was more painful than dangerous, but Pontus was immobilized and thereafter directed the attack while being carried from place to place on a makeshift stretcher. The most powerful weapons Pontus had brought from France were 6 great artillery mortars, able to fire 24 and 36-pound balls. Pontus named them the Royal Battery in honor of his sponsor, Louis XIV. Merely manhandling these monsters ashore and setting them in place consumed the better part of a week. Meanwhile, the bombardment with lesser cannon went on. Now, the siege guns were finally in place and ready to commence with their terrible work. On the evening of April 29th, after only a day of thundering bombardment by the mortars, the first breach appeared in the walls of Gestemani. Ducasse, who had recovered from his wound sufficiently to return to battle, reported to Pontus that he thought the position could be taken easily and quickly if the French moved before the Spaniards had time to redeploy their troops and plug the breach. With the French regulars giving fire in support, Ducasse led the Buccaneers in a howling, headlong charge that swept through the breach and carried the day. Scores of Spaniards were slain. Pontus later admitted that Ducasse had been the first man over the rubble over the broken wall, but the spiteful admiral could not refrain from adding, "Not so nimble as the rest, despite all his goodwill." Ducasse had so much trouble to climb that he was out of breath by the time he got to the top, where he thought he would never recover his wind. Pontus neglected to mention that Ducasse had suffered 2 more flesh wounds during the savage attack. With Gestemani overrun, only the walls of Cartagena stood between Pontus and fulfillment of his audacious dream. And he later wrote that he felt himself for the first time rid of all uneasiness for the success of this action, which may, with modesty, be termed very bold and very extraordinary for seafaring men. Cartagena's governor, having seen what the great guns of the Royal Battery could do, sent word that he would surrender under certain conditions. The terms required that the Spanish would not be ill-treated in any way, the churches were not to be despoiled, and the citizenry would keep their personal possessions. These conditions were far more generous than those customarily granted, and the Baron de Pontus was by no means a charitable man, but he had information that 2,000 Spanish reinforcements were marching from the hinterland, and there was always the specter of the British Admiral Neville and his squadrons lurking somewhere beyond the horizon. Pontus granted the terms. On May 6, 1697, Don Diego de los Rios y Quesada rode out through the Gate of the Half Moon in full dress uniform, leading the Spanish garrison and the townspeople for the formal surrender. All told, almost 3,000 Spaniards were in the melancholy procession. Pontus, still in pain from his wound, was also on horseback to receive them. He later recalled, "We too, the governor and I, were upon our horses, and having saluted me with his sword and some expression of civility, he continued on his way, and the garrison all marched out before sunset." But as soon as the ceremonies were done, Pontus repaired once more to his couch, and issued orders for the treasure to be collected with all possible speed. Well aware that much of the wealth of the city had been hidden, and believing that he had little time for a thorough search, he decreed that 1/10 of all the declared wealth could be kept by the owner, or by anyone giving information on hidden sums. Knowing their fellow citizens to be more greedy than honorable, and fearing that they might lose everything unless they cooperated, the Cartagenians brought their riches to Pontus in wagon loads, and the baron gloated those who were charged with counting the treasure were not able to weigh the silver fast enough. By Pontus's questionable reckoning, the total take came to some 8 million livres. Ducasse estimated closer to 20 million, and as quickly as it was collected and weighed, it was stowed aboard the French warships. By now the rainy season had officially arrived, and with it, mosquitoes, yellow fever, and other plagues. In just 6 days, 800 Frenchmen, nearly 1/5 of the original force, were infected, and most died. Few of the stricken were buccaneers. Pontus noted that they were accustomed to these climates, and they were infected with the unhealthiness of the air already. When the fleet was at last ready to sail, the buccaneers, who had so far seen not so much as a livre to call their own, demanded not simply a fifth, but 1/4 share of the loot, then and there. Presumably they had taken a head count and upped their demand because of all the dead French. The seemingly aghast Pontus replied from his sickbed that the buccaneers had never been promised even 1/5 of the whole treasure. They had agreed to share man for man with the French regulars, and the regulars were being paid on the basis of 10 of the first million and 30 of subsequent millions. The buccaneers could have 1/4 of that. The rest went to pay back the investors and to the king. By that accounting, the buccaneers would divide some 40,000 livres instead of the 1.6 million to 4 million, depending on whose word for the total was accepted, that they deemed they were due. Pontus was especially indignant at Ducasse for insisting that he honor the financial pledge he had made at the outset of the Cartagena expedition. Pontus later wrote, "I was a long time before I could comprehend that his misapprehension should carry him so far as to imagine that the credit of so many people was used, much address employed, great sums of money collected and expended, and so long a voyage undertaken to give 1/4 of what it produced to the governor of Saint Domingue and his troop of bandits, the greatest part of them idle spectators in the great action." With those sentiments, on May 31st, Pontus sailed out of the bay. He retained only 10 ships to transport the treasure and his battered and much reduced expeditionary force. He burned the remaining vessels, which only further infuriated the already enraged buccaneers, some of whom wished to give chase and attack the flagship. For the final time, Ducasse restrained them, promising to go and represent them before the king. Intent on keeping his word, he too departed for Saint Domingue, from which he planned to take passage for France. Close behind him sailed the buccaneer squadron. But there were those among the cheated buccaneers who held that a sure thing was better than a promise. After going only a few leagues, 4 captains brought their ships about and headed back to the prostrate city. This time there were no terms given, and with unrestrained rape, torture, and the sacking of churches and homes, the buccaneers made clear their intent not to leave before the sum of 5 million livres was paid to them. It says something of Pontus's haste in departing that he left so much behind as to meet the brigands' demands, and for the last time in the history of the Caribbean, a significant force of buccaneers set sail with booty-laden ships. Meanwhile, Pontus, who had regained his health at sea, decided to make directly for the channel between Cuba and the Bahamas. He thought thereby to give the slip to the English, who he imagined, since they had not caught up with him at Cartagena, would be awaiting him off Saint Domingue. In fact, Neville, with a combined English and Dutch fleet, was sailing south to intercept him, and in the darkness of the night, June 6th and 7th, the two fleets interwove just south of Jamaica like strands in a long splice. At daybreak, the French counted 29 enemy sail around them. The odds against the French were nearly 3 to 1, and 8 of the largest English ships, each equal to or better than Pontus's flagship the Scepter, had the weather gauge against the French. Dismal misfortune, as Pontus put it, had replaced the luck that had so far graced his enterprise. Further noting, What an altercation for me in particular. Further reflecting, Pontus writes, "The taking of Cartagena seemed to have acquired me a pleasing distinction, and being enriched, I had, at my return, a prospect of glory and pleasures. All that now passed like a shadow, and I had before my eyes the destruction of a flourishing squadron, which I had the honor to be entrusted with." What Pontus did not know was that the English ships were woefully undermanned. Neville hesitated to attack for an entire day as he sought to marshal his whole force and descend on the French in mass. The delay was costly, for during the night Pontus neatly reversed course. By the next dawn he had put considerable distance between their fleets. Crowding on sail in an attempt to catch up, a number of English ships lost their rigging. In the end, the French simply outsailed them. Riding the Gulf Stream north, Pontus reached Newfoundland, where he put into Conception Bay for water and provisions. There he learned of a squadron of 8 English men of war in the port of St. John's, less than 25 miles down the coast. Seizing the initiative, Pontus headed south and found the enemy still in port. He later explained, "Apparently some reflection of the force of largest of our ships had prevented them from coming out. I was contented to show myself and offer them battle, which, seeing they did not answer, we steered for the coast of France." Toward the end of August, the French sighted yet a third English fleet. This one near the Scilly Isles, just off the tip of England. Pontus fought a running battle through the course of a long afternoon, and when night came he was still able to sail away. There remained now only the British blockade off the French ports to run. To Admiral Pontus, that posed no more of a problem than his original escape. On the dark night of August 28th, his fleet simply slipped unseen through the loose net of the patrolling British into the haven of Brest. Pontus had been gone just 1 week less than 8 months, and he carried a fortune in his holds. In September 1697, France signed the Treaty of Ryswick, making peace with Spain, England, and Holland. Under the terms of the pact, Spain formally recognized French possession of Saint Domingue. No mention was made of the French colonies on Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Kitts, which in French eyes amounted to tacit recognition. Nor was any mention made of the Dutch or English colonies, which in the eyes of those nations solidified their claims. In return, all three pledged to help the Spaniards suppress buccaneers in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Henceforth, buccaneers who sailed the Caribbean in their small ships to prey on other seafaring men would do so without commission as privateers, outlawed as common pirates by all nations, and facing an almost certain fate on the noose if they were caught. Jean Bernard Louis de Jans, Baron de Pontus, lived in France until his death in 1707. He was wealthy, and he was much admired for his great deed, but he was unbeloved, as if he cared. Jean-Baptiste Ducasse also returned to France, where he was made a Knight of the Order of St. Louis, was promoted to Admiral, and was assured by Minister of Marine Pontchartrain that His Majesty is as satisfied with your conduct as you could possibly desire. As he promised, Ducasse fought for and finally won a settlement of 1.4 million francs to be distributed among the buccaneers Pontus had built. But in the end, the buccaneers would have virtually nothing to show for their adventures. They had lost nearly everything they had looted from Cartagena. On their way back to the stronghold of the island of Hispaniola, they had run afoul of Neville's squadron and lost 4 ships, 2 of which carried the bulk of their plunder. And most of the money won from them by Ducasse simply and quietly disappeared for expenses and graft on the way to the West Indies. Toward the end of his life, Ducasse might have reflected on the curious tricks politics and fate played on men. In 1708, with Spain and France now allied, Admiral Ducasse was detached for service with the Spanish fleet, his old enemy. His assignment, fantastic as it may seem, was to convoy the Spanish treasure fleet from Veracruz to Seville, and to draw on his vast experience to protect it from pirates swarming in the Caribbean. That first year he lost only 2 vessels to the brigands, and the next year he got the entire convoy through without a scratch. For this remarkable feat, Ducasse was awarded one of the highest honors within the power of King of Spain to give, the Order of the Golden Fleece. No act could have better signified the passing of the day of the buccaneers on the Spanish Main. Ducasse died in 1714 at the age of 69, the last of the great buccaneering leaders.